So welcome everyone to our webinar, County Level Natural Capital Investment. Today we are joined by Matt Whitney. Matt has a background in renewable energy, sustainable transport and non-financial corporate reporting and currently manages the Oxford Local Nature Partnership. Today's webinar will outline a model for leveraging green finance at county level to deliver against local strategic objects. As always, there'll be a chance to ask questions at the end of the presentation. So submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation, and I will ask these on your behalf at the end. Thank you for logging in today, and I'll now hand over to Matt.
Thanks very much, and hello everyone. Thanks for joining us this lunchtime. So as trailed, I'm Matt Whitney. I'm the LNP manager for Oxfordshire, the local nature partnership manager. And I should say I'm not an environmental scientist, so I hope that this presentation is pitched at the right level for you, that I'm not teaching you to suck eggs, nor am I going into far too much detail that's difficult to follow. But I think it's a really interesting area, an emerging area of work in the UK, although there's significant precedent for it globally. And yeah, I'll try and talk you through how my work intersects this world and how and why the local county level is the right level at which to try and work. So I'm going to introduce myself and what local nature partnerships are. I'm going to outline what the problem is that this concept is trying to solve. I'm going to explain natural capital, and again, forgive me if that's teaching people to suck eggs. I'm going to give a quick intro into natural capital account because I think it's an interesting concept to consider when we're looking at this. I'm going to talk about investment readiness for projects and what natural capital investment aims to do, and then I'm going to shine a spotlight on a couple of specific markets, the two probably more mature markets in the UK. So, as I say, I'm not an environmental scientist. I don't have a background in nature either, despite managing a local nature partnership. Or I don't have a long background in nature. As trailed, I've worked in loads of different environmental sustainability worlds, so transport, energy and reporting. But more recently, I've done a master's looking at how collective action, facilitation of collective action amongst farmers and landowners can help to achieve landscape scale environmental benefits. And that work has really propelled me into this role, which is looking to do that basically on a county level. Local nature partnerships were established but not funded by DEFRA. It came out of the Lawton Review, Making Space for Nature white paper 2011, I think it was. And they were conceived as a direct counterpoint to local enterprise partnerships, although in true governmental fashion, BEIS were able to get funding for LEPs, but DEFRA were unable to get central government funding for LMPs. Therefore, there's a patchy network of LMPs across the country, although it's an improving situation. They're mostly funded by local partners. So my role is funded by local enterprise partnership, the local authorities, but also have contributions on the board from the wildlife NGOs, the statutory agencies of Environment Agency, Natural England. The university provides a lot of support as well. So it's really wide-ranging partnership. And also on the board, we've got a representative from the business sector and a representative from the farming sector. And I think those two reps are really crucial when we come to think about this area of work. The idea of local nature partnerships is to consider nature as an enabler, not a barrier, via a natural capital approach. And I'll outline what that means shortly. As I say, I used to manage Gloucestershire Local Nature Partnership for a few years, and now manage the Oxfordshire Local Nature Partnership. Both share three strategic priority areas that they're working within. So one of those is nature recovery, and the main task there is going to be developing the local nature recovery strategy, which has been mandated by the Environment Act 2021. Natural capital investment, which is essentially what we're here to talk about today, and people and nature, so where nature and the natural environment impacts health and well-being, so through green infrastructure, etc. So what's the problem? You'll probably all know this stuff already, but it's not a good picture for nature in the UK. I've got some, facts and figures that you've probably quoted yourselves and heard quoted at you a number of times, but it's not a good situation for nature in the UK. Government has set world-leading targets. I think it's fair to call them world-leading targets, but unfortunately, at the moment, there's a distinct lack of policy, legislation, and funding to deliver those targets. What we know is that there's they reckon about a £56 billion gap in funding that's required for us to meet these world-leading targets. So that's about £6 billion a year for the UK, and that money isn't going to be found from central government. It's not going to be found from local government, and it's not going to be found from the environmental NGOs putting in charitable fund applications either. So we need to seek private investment, private funding of natural capital and nature-based solutions at all scales, actually. So a few definitions. The title slide of this presentation talks about green finance and natural capital. Green finance can mean two things. You can either green finance. So greening finance is the creation of more sustainable financial products and services, such as, you can get better mortgage rates if you've got an energy efficient house. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about financing green, so using private money to fund nature recovery. Also talked about the natural capital approach a couple of times. There's a quote there from the Natural Capital Committee that defines natural capital. It's essentially our land, air and water. They're the assets. So this is an economic frame of thinking. They're the assets, and from those assets flow services, which can be categorized into four different areas. Provisioning services, that's, nature provides us with food, and the natural environment provides us with food. Regulating services, so it can clean water and provide pollination services. And cultural services is the other main one, difficult to define, but that's things like interaction with nature, recreation, education. It might even include inspiration in there. From those ecosystem services flow a number of benefits, which could be wood to light the fire, or improved health and well-being outcomes, or a reduction to flooding. And those benefits have value. So the next thing, if I've got this in the right order, the next thing we're going to talk about, next thing we're going to talk about actually is natural capital accounting. So those environmental benefits delivered from natural capital have value. Natural capital accounting is an approach that tries to quantify the value that the benefits we get, the value of the benefits that we get from natural capital. Good quote from that Wilding book there, which is I don't know, contentious and provocative, but makes a decent point, and it explains basically what natural capital approach is. We're trying to get nature into decision making. We're trying to get nature into the economic system, into the business case, in order that it can be considered more appropriately and thoroughly. So Environment Agency have created an NCRAT tool, the Natural Capital Register and Accounts tool, and what that does is it attempts to put that financial value on the benefits that we get from nature. So how does it work, this tool? It's essentially a really, really complicated spreadsheet. You put in habitat quantity and quality and various other locally held data sets into the thing. The process is essentially poorly understood by me, but the natural capital team at the Environment Agency are able to explain this really well. And what the output is essentially an asset register, and it's presented in really visually pleasing ways. So we did a natural capital account for Gloucestershire, and it showed that of the land in Gloucestershire, it's about 280,000 hectares, provides £500 million worth of free services, free ecosystem services per annum, and that values natural capital at £16.4 billion over the next 100 years. So they're big numbers, and that enables us to have a baseline to think about, this is what the value of our natural capital is at the moment, and we can assess change from there. I love Sankey diagrams. This is shows you on the left what habitat types, what the main habitat types are, so what Gloucestershire is made up of, and on the right shows you which ecosystem services are provided to what level by those habitat types. So that's natural capital accounting, and we've explained what natural capital is. We've demonstrated that we need to enhance it because of the sorry state of nature in this country, and because of the environmental benefits that we can get from nature. But why would a business spend money on natural capital enhancement? There's the reasons for this can be grouped into three areas. First one is risk. So companies are recognizing that their business models are dependent on nature, essentially, that all of their operations or pretty much all their operations are grounded to some degree in a functioning natural environment. But there is a risk that stable situation isn't going to remain stable, and that those services that businesses get from nature won't be provided anymore. So, and there's a number of frameworks that exist for measuring that risk and assessing it from a business perspective. Another reason why businesses might spend money on enhancing natural capital is that they have to. So legislation is being introduced in a number of areas that require mitigation of impact, which is often results in purchase of credits that to offset the impact that the business has. And Biodiversity Net Gain, which I'll talk about shortly, is an example of that. Another reason why businesses might spend money on nature is because customers increasingly are looking for businesses that are green, let's say. That we call those voluntary markets, where businesses don't have to but choose to spend money on natural capital enhancement. And carbons at the moment for most businesses is a voluntary market in the UK, but there's more and more companies who are trying to develop pathways to net zero, are looking at offsetting their carbon or their residual carbon emissions. So businesses in some instances want to spend money on natural capital enhancement or on nature, but it's really difficult to do that. There's really high transaction costs for businesses, so it's hard to engage in this market, and there's lots of steps that you've got to go through before you can essentially make a transaction. So it's a really complicated process, and one of the really big challenges here is the scarcity of projects that exist. Over 70% of the UK is farmed, and that land is farmed and managed by farmers and landowners, and this is a really new area for everybody. It's a really new area for those farmers and landowners, and it essentially, if we want to do natural capital enhancement, we have to do it on land that is owned and managed by somebody, and we have to, in many cases, radically change the land use that's happening there. So farmers are at varying levels of beginning to understand this. And we have a national government scheme of ELM, environmental land management, which is replacing the common agricultural policy, which is starting to move in that direction, encouraging and rewarding farmers for the environmental benefits that their land provides. But A, Elm is new still, and B, it's really poorly defined, and we don't know what the offers are for farmers. So even if farmers want to do this stuff, they don't know whether to wait to see what Elm is going to pay them, or do carbon credits, or chuck a load of solar panels on their land, or get into a biodiversity net gain scheme, or keep farming and wait for soil carbon opportunities to arise. So it's a really complicated area, and that's just one of the reasons why there aren't enough projects existing at the moment for businesses to buy services from, or for investors to invest into. The diagram on the right here shows steps to investment readiness. So these are the steps, or the process you have to go through in order to complete a natural capital investment transaction, essentially, or a natural capital environmental benefit transaction. So what we're doing on a local level, on a county level, is seeking investment to prepare and deliver projects that improve the environment. And then, so that's not the purchase of credits, that's an investment that somebody or an organization would make, that it can be repaid by selling the credits that result from that nature recovery. If I'm right on the next slide, I can explain that a little bit more. Yeah, so rather than having a project, they develop the project themselves and then sell the credits to someone who wants to buy them. You've got a third party now who's investing lots of money in the preparation of loads of different projects that are then able to sell credits as soon as the buyer comes along, rather than the buyer of the credits having to liaise and get that project ready and develop it along and get it delivered and then have credits to buy. The investor has preempted that by getting all of these projects ready. Then as soon as the developer or the business comes along that wants to buy a credit, they're all ready, we can sell them the credits, and through that money we can repay the investment. So it reduces those transaction costs, reduces the time lag between any potential loss of habitat, let's say in Biodiversity Net Gain's case, and the resulting gain of habitat, and just streamlines the whole process. So that, I feel I've not done a very good job of explaining that, and hopefully giving some case study examples will start to put some flesh on the bones of that for you. So Biodiversity Net Gain, as many of you probably know, it is another thing that's come through from the Environment Act 2021 in the UK, and it's a planning condition that requires a 10% increase in biodiversity. It's applied to, let's say a housing development. You've got a green field and it's got 100 units of biodiversity on it, and for biodiversity there's a proxy of habitat. So we've got 100 units on this field. We're now going to build a housing estate. We need there to be 110 units of habitat or biodiversity at the end of us building. So we need to increase the amount of nature on the site by 10% as a result of our development. We need to try and do that on site, and the diagram on the right shows you the mitigation hierarchy. We need to try not to lose the habitat in the first place. Then we need to deliver that gain on site if we can, and only if we can't deliver it on site, only if Barrett's Homes can't develop enough green infrastructure within the red line of their housing development, then they must seek to buy credits or to invest in habitat creation off-site that they can count towards their 110% that they're aiming for. We use a thing called the dephrometric for calculating the before and after. And these off-site biodiversity credits is one of the income streams for natural capital investment. Essentially, if you're doing an off-site scheme that's generating credits that can be sold to a housing developer, you need to demonstrate your management plan, how many credits will be produced within a 30-year period. So that farmer or landowner who's entering into this agreement, who's changing their land use to provide these biodiversity net gain credits needs to enter into a contract for 30 years. Farmers and landowners are not used to doing this. They're used to entering into stewardship agreements for a couple of years. So this is a big change to how they operate. And just for your understanding, currently biodiversity net gain units are looking at being about 20 or 25,000 pounds. So that's £1,000 a year. Quite a good bit of management up front first, but then probably minimal management after that. On some sites, you might get 2 or 3 units per hectare. So that gives you an idea of the scale of this thing. There's big problems of management and monitoring of biodiversity net gain on site and off site, because planning departments and local governments are just drastically underfunded. What we want to do by managing this market or helping to oversee this market at a county scale is to ensure that we can deliver, we can spatially prioritize where these off-site gains take place via use of our local evidence to ensure that we're getting the biggest bang for our buck, and we're not just allowing, let's say, Barrett's Homes to do their off-site net gain wherever they want, in the cheapest possible place, in the cheapest possible way, which is possibly what a market might lead to if unregulated and unstructured. What we want to happen is for those gains to be delivered where we know it's crucial to connect bits of habitat up, or to enhance bits of habitats to have a more kind of robust and ecologically coherent network of habitat across the county and across England. There's also a bit of an ethical debate within biodiversity net gain. Are we using this policy to do strategic nature recovery? If we are, then we probably want quite a lot of the gain to be delivered off-site, actually. But if we're using this policy to enhance the nature value of places that people live and work, then we'd want that gain to be delivered on-site. And the mitigation hierarchy, enforces that, so that housing developments are more nature rich. But that might not perhaps be the best use of the biodiversity net gain money from a strategic nature recovery perspective. So yeah, that's not something I'm giving an answer on. That's just one of the debates within this. So I've explained that for a business to engage in this directly with a landowner can be really complicated, can be high transaction costs, and can take a long time. By using something like a broker or a central hub within a county, we can start to smooth that process for both the landowner and for the developer. In Oxfordshire, we have Trust for Oxfordshire's Environment, or TOE, which is an interesting name for an environmental funder. What they've been doing so far is to sell credits to housing developers and then use that money to deliver off-site gains. But they take the money first, and the housing developer doesn't know where that credit is being delivered. They don't care. They've bought their credit. They can show that to Southern Vale District Council office planning officers and demonstrate that they've met their biodiversity net gain requirements and get planning permission. With biodiversity net gain policy that's coming in next year, this won't work. The developer, through the planning system, will have to show where their offsite gains, which particular project and which particular habitats their offsite credits are delivering. In order to do that, without a massive time lag to the planning system, what we need is to create habitat banks. We need that investor to pump prime delivery of a load of projects, so we've got them ready. So as soon as Mr. or Mrs. developer comes to us and says, I need to buy 4 credits so I can get through planning, we can say, great, we've got credits that are here, the habitat's already being delivered, give us your money, and these are your credits, this is where it is, this is the quality thing that's being delivered, and then they can show that to the planning authority and get their planning permission. But without that investment first off, you're unable to get those credits ready for when the housing developer needs them. and that will create massive time lag for the housing, for planning systems and for the delivery of new homes. Again, quite a lot of detail. Sorry if I've not gone over that well, but I think hopefully that gives you an idea of why working at a county scale and why brokerage and why investment can be important to enable a local natural capital market. Second case study I'm going to give you is carbon. Might be more familiar with this one perhaps. In the UK, it's a voluntary market. At the moment, we have the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatlands Carbon Code, but because of the nature of Gloucestershire and Oxfordshire, I've only engaged with the Woodland Carbon Code. And the diagram on the right shows you basically how it works. So carbon credits become available at different points during the cycle of growth of the woodlands that you're creating. At the moment, carbon price is really low. It's about, for English tree carbon, let's say, it's about 20 quid a tonne. So we worked out some maths on this, and on a 30 hectare site, after 30 years, you'll have only created 30 grand's worth of credits, £30,000 worth of credits. So that there's no way that a farmer or landowner is making that as a financial business decision. They're only going to engage with this Woodland Carbon Code if they wanted to plant trees anyway. That's my understanding of it from an economics perspective, from the farmer's perspective when they're looking at their business case. What we are seeing locally is demand for carbon plus. So if you want to get your biggest bang for your buck by applying the Woodland Carbon Code, you're probably going to plant massive Sitka spruce plantations, which do loads of carbon more quickly, but don't provide additional benefits. And we know that different habitat types can provide multiple benefits. If you think back to the Sankey diagram, different habitat types can provide lots of different ecosystem services. So carbon plus is the idea that you're not just buying carbon, but you're buying biodiversity uplift. You may be buying access, so by the provision of footpaths to woodland creation scheme, or by the interspersal of lots of different native broadleaf trees and probably some climate resilient trees. We can start to create biodiverse, accessible habitats that are, again, if we do this on a county scale, we can ensure they're located in the best places to allow woodland connectivity. And we're seeing increasingly that local buyers, local businesses really want to invest. They want to invest locally because they want to take their shareholders around the site and go, here's the trees that we planted to do our offsetting, rather than offsetting in, spending their money on renewable energy installation in China or something. And also they increasingly want to do this carbon plus. They want to deliver the additional benefits because it's a good CSR story for them, frankly. So what the Woodland Carbon Code does require is basically it means you can't produce food on that land anymore unless you do a bit of light agroforestry. We think this is a big challenge. We think it's a big problem for the UK's aim to get towards net zero. If trees is the only way we can get accredited carbon. What we do know is that through changing farming practices, not stopping farming practices, but changing farming practices towards a more agroecological or regenerative approach, we can boost the carbon in the soil. Now, the quantification isn't quite there yet, but there is a soil carbon code in development, and that would allow farmers to keep farming, to keep producing food, but also to benefit from an income boost of selling the carbon that they store by those different farming techniques. It may be you think actually that the farmer shouldn't be selling that carbon, they should be using it to offset their own emissions. And again, that's a kind of moral contradiction that I'm not going to get into, but that soil carbon code does seem like a really key piece here. But it's a long way off being bankable at this stage. So a case study here is in Oxfordshire. Morgan Sindall is a construction company. They basically spent £1 million on carbon credits. through a company called Forest Canopy, which is like a broker, I suppose. And they were able to, and they've spent that £1 million on woodland creation scheme within the grounds of Blenheim. So if the market price of carbon is 10 to 20 quid a tonne, they spent about 50 quid a tonne, because they weren't just buying carbon, they were buying into and funding the creation of a really quality woodland creation scheme that delivers massive multiple benefits. It's got loads of accessible footpaths through it. It reduces flood risk because it's a lot of it's riparian planting, and it's also really good for biodiversity as well. It's a really well-designed scheme, and they really wanted to invest in a well-designed scheme locally, so they could take their shareholders and tell their customers, look at all this good stuff we're doing. So I think it's a really good example that this money is there and people want to spend this money, but it's Blenheim are in a position to be able to take a 100-year view of their land in terms of return on investment, whereas many farmers and landowners aren't able to do that, and that raises questions about equity, I think. So why is the county level the right level to do this at? Investors want scale, so if we're looking for that investment rather than just a direct transactional approach, we need a suite of projects for them to invest in, rather than investing in one particular project, because it's likely not big enough to attract the interest of an institutional investor. And the county level allows aggregation of that through a central hub, potentially like TOW that I outlined. County level is a coherent policy environment. Although local planning authorities may have slightly differing plans and policies, we've got the development of the local nature recovery strategy, which is going to be county-wide, and that provides, as I say, a consistent policy environment within which to work. It also aligns with local evidence. So I was saying that we want to deliver these projects, whether they're off-site biodiversity net gain or woodland creation projects, we want them to deliver the biggest bang for buck that we can in terms of delivering multiple benefits. And increasingly counties have natural capital mapping as well as nature recovery network mapping that shows where the best places to do different interventions are. The county scale is the scale at which those mapping projects are taking place, and therefore doing this at a county scale, it seems right. This is a very complicated slide, and I wasn't sure whether to include it, but I just wanted to set a bit of national context here at the end of my presentation to say that we're lacking some leadership and guidance from central government about land use. Land use, as I've outlined, from the farmer and landowner's position, from the local authorities' position, what are the levers that we've got for influencing farmers and landowners changing land use? And from a farmer and landowner's position, they don't know what decision to make often, because they don't know the financial implications of that decision, because we haven't got subsidy schemes and we haven't got firm pricing and policy around all this stuff. So some of you might be aware that the House of Lords Select Committee on Land Use is about to produce a white paper in the next couple of weeks. I was lucky enough to engage with that select committee, as were Food Farming and Countryside Commission, who put a really strong case for the development of a land use framework nationally. Now, it's probably not going to be blobs on maps, and the National Food Strategy did do a 3-compartment approach to a land use framework, or posited one, but it might be some principles by which we make decisions about what should happen to land, and then that should happen at a national level, and then local land use frameworks could be developed that would say, okay, we want this much renewable energy, this much biofuel creation in our county, this much of our land is going to be managed for nature, and this much of our land is going to be used for food. Then we can start to spatially distribute that and work. But crucially, I think he's working with farmers and landowners to make those decisions, because ultimately it's their businesses, it's their land, it's their livelihoods, it's their culture, it's their way of life that decisions like this are going to affect. So I just wanted to step out a moment and look at that picture. So conclusion, it's really complicated. A lot of it's contentious. You know, there might be some things that I've said today that some of you disagree with, morally or for any other means, and you know that's totally fair enough. I recognise that when I enter into this kind of this world. I think it's a massive opportunity for us to make real strides towards delivering our nature recovery ambitions in this country. I think county scale is the right scale at which to do it, but we do need more central government guidance and leadership. And just to make that point again, that you know we need to be in constant dialogue with farmers and landowners to make sure that any decisions we make at a county or a national scale are the right decisions for them. And then I don't know if I'm sharing this slide deck afterwards, but I put some links in there as well. Shall I stop sharing now?
Yeah, that'd be great. We do have a couple of questions. Anyone that has any questions, just pop them in the Q&A box. You noticed you mentioned there that you, I had someone ask if you were happy to share the slides afterwards. Is that?
Yeah, that should be fine. No problem at all.
Perfect. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions. The first one here is a little bit, might be helpful for those that are looking to kind of transition into a similar area, but it's what was your career path into this area of work?
What should we say? I did a humanities undergrad. I was a hippie for 4 years, and then I studied permaculture for a year. So I don't know what that gives you, but then I went into sales. So sales in sustainability. So I sold solar panels. I've sold shared use electric vehicles for councils and for communities, and then I went into non-financial corporate reporting, so basically helping massive corporates to report their sustainability credentials. And it's through that broad background that I think it's because of that broad background that the natural capital approach really appeals to me. I think, you know, and we're getting back to that Isabella Tree quote, the nature for nature's sake argument is right. You know, it's accurate, it's impactful, but it doesn't enable us to get this into decision making. So I think having that broad background really benefited me when I went and did the masters, which I did a few years ago. After all that sales experience, I did the masters and started to think about how to apply that through a local level with farmers and landowners, and that masters really is what that was the key stepping stone from my background to getting into local nature partnerships.
Fantastic. So there's a question here from Maria and Brett. So if the need for the biodiversity bank first, how does that get set up? Who invests the initial cost of setting up the bank? Yeah, so if we're talking about the central hub or kind of broker model there, in Oxfordshire, TOW already existed. It used to distribute the landfill tax, and many counties will have an environmental funder that used to distribute the landfill tax. And they basically pivoted. They saw this opportunity and worked very closely with the local planning authorities who in Oxfordshire were really proactive in developing and implementing biodiversity net gain policies. So that's been done. That's taken place gradually and incrementally. I would say that TOW has now probably reached the scale at which, you know, if it was a private enterprise, it'd be float or fold. It needs to change in order to grow, and that's going to require investment. And certainly, so I convene a natural capital investment community of practice nationally, and there's lots of different counties who are looking at the right way to do this. In some places, it's a wildlife trust-led model. I think a more interesting way to do it is to have an independent broker that's got the support and backing of the local nature partnership, but crucially the support and backing of the local authorities.
because it's via them that a lot of these things are going to be delivered. I think also with that central hub, it's just so key that all of this work aligns with local nature recovery strategy, and the evidence that is held locally. There was a thing called the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, which was central government funding distributed by the Environment Agency that helped to pump prime a lot of these projects. Now, most of that was project level, but some of it was for governance, and some of that helped to establish the Greater Manchester Environment Fund, for instance. And we looked at applying for that for when I was in Gloucestershire, and we set up the Gloucestershire Nature and Climate Fund. The website's just gone live, and it's an attempt to do that, to try to bring in that money, but it does require investment. And where does that money come from? Local authorities, most of them have declared, I think all of them have declared climate emergencies. Most of them have declared ecological emergencies, and I think all of them are really struggling with how to deliver this. So I think there's a really strong case to be made for a little bit of money. I know local authorities are really resource poor, but it doesn't take much to get something like this set up. We did it in Gloucestershire for 70 grand, but now it's at a position where it can start to deliver these offsite biodiversity net gains, and the local planning authorities have no idea how to do that by and large. So I think they see that as money really, really well spent.
So do you find that some of that money is made back once the developers start to invest and buy their credits?
Yeah, so I think the direct setup costs, you're never going to get that back directly, but the alternative is local planning authorities figuring out how to do this themselves. That's going to cost a lot more than, that was 70 grand across 6 LPAs in Gloucestershire, and the money didn't actually all come from them. So for each of them to have done it individually is going to cost at least one full-time member of staff, I'd suggest. And suddenly your incomement's much higher than that 70 grand. I should say there are loads of players trying to get into this market. Many of you might be aware of the Environment Bank, who are trying to deliver biodiversity net gain nationally, and they're selling their services as a local delivery mechanism as well. I think there's a lot of challenges with that model, or imperfections perhaps. First is that they can't guarantee it's going to be done local to the development, and most councils are going to want the offsite gain to happen within their district, basically. So if the housing is going here, we want the biodiversity net gain to go here as well. And the Environment Bank aren't going to be able to do that. Secondly, I think that the Environment Bank are for profit. So that means money's leaving the county or leaving the local area. And local planning authorities are not going to want that, I think, in many cases. But the Environment Bank provides a really good, they provide this service, and they're already kind of set up to do it with those caveats. The Environment Bank were massively heavily invested in. I mean, millions and millions of pounds. They got an investor because that investor saw return because it's a for-profit company. So that exists as well.
Okay, we have one last question, and it's got a few different parts to it. So do you think that the present government is going to be enabling process? Do you think that the present government is going to be enabling progress in this area? What about the review of ELMS that Liz Truss announced? Isn't that causing uncertainty?
Yes, that's causing uncertainty. Is this present government going to? I mean, that's a hell of a question that I'm not going to be able to answer. What I do know is we've got CBD, the COP for biodiversity, that is happening. Is it now or is it very soon? Either way, the government is going to that to call for, and they say they're trying to lead the creation of global targets for this. So they're talking a big game. They've got, and it's this Conservative government. It's Michael Gove, when he was Environment Secretary, created the 25-year Environment Plan. That's a really great document. We shouldn't take that away. That's a fantastic document which has laid the groundwork for the Environment Act. The Agriculture Act kind of fell out of that as well, really. and that's all good news. But where's the secondary legislation? Where's all the proper stuff that's going to enable us to enact that stuff? We're still waiting for guidance and secondary regulation for the local nature recovery strategies. I'd be amazed if the rollout of Biodiversity Net Gain isn't delayed from November 23 next year to into 24. And ELM, the writing was on the wall, it seems to me, when they started to include productivity within that. It was supposed to be all about environmental benefits, and then suddenly they're funding people for productivity, and we haven't had set budgets. The budget for ELM is only set until the end of this Parliament. So I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that they have natural capital and green finance teams within DEFRA that are really great and really trying in this area. But progress is painfully slow, and people really need that confidence from government in order to make decisions.
Perfect, thank you. Thanks for the presentation and thanks for answering those questions. So that's it from us today, attendees. Thank you for logging in. I hope you found it beneficial and informative.